First of all, this is part of something I'm working on right now, which will hopefully at some point become a book. And the main question I'm trying to ask is, how does a stateless nation maintain its sense of being a nation? And you shouldn't confuse this question with why a stateless people wants to be a nation. I think that's something that a lot of people have given opinions on, but really, how do they maintain the idea of a nation once they desire it? And this is problematic from a scholarly point of view because most literature on nations and nationalism is very state-centric. There's a lot of focus on the role of the state in cultivating nationalism, sometimes among minorities, but there's not much about how groups that are stateless actually maintain and reproduce their national identity. And furthermore, recent work on the ethnography of the state, which is something that's becoming increasingly popular in American anthropology, suggests that states are stronger and stronger in cultivating hegemony and controlling space and populations. So this makes the job of a stateless people in cultivating a national identity even more difficult. They're faced with kind of a dual challenge of both evading the hegemony of the states in which they live and creating their own sense of hegemonic order, an idea of the discipline of the nation and what it means to be, for example, a Uyghur. And what I'm trying to do in answering that question is looking at the work of Michel Foucault on governmentality and turning it on its head. So for those of you who haven't read Foucault's work on governmentality, I'll just try to give a brief outline. Foucault suggests that in the 18th century, particularly in Europe, there's a transformation in the way states related with citizens. And states no longer merely ruled over territories or subjugated people. They began to rule through populations, and they sought to take care of their populations. This is kind of the birth of citizenship, let's say. And in his work, there's a strong focus on institutions of the state. And in particular, the way these institutions manufacture truth. This means institutions like schools, universities, hospitals, prisons, law enforcement, and so on. And through such institutions, states no longer dominate citizens through force exclusively. They may use force, but not exclusively. They also control and care for their populations through the power of knowledge. So I've been trying to look at this concept in terms of the Uyghurs, and in particular looking at the Uyghur community in Kazakhstan in the 1990s, because as somebody mentioned before lunch, this was a special window of opportunity where there was an opportunity for Uyghurs on both sides of the border to interact, and there was a relative amount of freedom that allowed for that interaction and a lot of freedom of expression. And I'm looking at what I already mentioned as this dual challenge facing stateless people, evading the power of the states in which they live and creating their own sense of community and disciplining that community. I'm looking at that as a process that I like to call self-governmentality. And the first part of that, evading the power of the states in which they live, is very similar to a lot of work that's been done by James Scott, a political scientist in America, who talks about the hill tribes of Southeast Asia. And he has a book that's a history of these people that he calls The Art of Not Being Governed, and how their entire social structure is intended to essentially avoid being ruled by any state in particular. On the other hand, it also involves a lot of what Foucault talks about. It means that the Uyghurs or any stateless people who want to cultivate a national identity have to create their own truths. They have to create their own morals and ideals, their own hegemonic order. And one of the differences is that they do not have the institutions of the state to do that. So what I am trying to suggest is that they do that more through informal hierarchies of power and community interaction. So just kind of looking at the difference between the self-governmentality and governmentality, self-governmentality lacks the strength and authoritative power of state-driven governmentality. It's also very conscious, and this is something I've found in working with Uyghurs over the last 20 years, is they're very conscious of the production of their nation. They're conscious in terms of how they portray the nation, how they discipline the ideas of the nation, whereas Foucault's idea of governmentality requires the citizenship to be unconscious of the intents of the state. And also, self-governmentality without the institutions of the state ends up being something very more grassroots, and it's constantly being negotiated. You don't have the power to say, this is what it means to be Uyghur. There's a constant negotiation between people with different viewpoints as to what it means to be Uyghur. And thus, it's both more localized and messy. So why am I looking at Kazakhstan in the 1990s? I feel that there were particular conditions that allowed for a moment of self-governmentality that was different than things that had come before it or since in many ways. So first, Kazakhstan in the 1990s itself had a weak sense of governmentality. In the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, the state lacked the institutions to really rule through their population. Kazakhstan also, at that time, was not that interested in surveilling its Uyghur population. They had more problems to deal with. And in fact, to some degree, Kazakhstan in the particularly early 1990s, because the state was so weak, it was encouraging populations to fend for themselves and figure out how do we make sense, how do we rule ourselves. Another condition that was particularly important in Kazakhstan in the 1990s was its geographic location in the borderlands with Xinjiang. And so that's kind of the area where most Uyghurs live in Kazakhstan. And I'm going to be particularly talking about the city of Almaty, which was kind of the center, and still is very much the center of this community. But the borderlands, in addition to providing access to Uyghurs in China, also have a certain kind of liminality. They provide an opportunity for populations to cross over into another state and kind of recognize the relativity of the truths that are enforced in their own state. And plus, it was a time of reuniting the Uyghur people on both sides of the border. And Uyghurs from Kazakhstan were encountering very different ideas about what it meant to be Uyghur in China and vice versa. So this is just some examples of cross-border interaction from the Berapolka Bazaar in Almaty, Kazakhstan, in several languages. And part of that was also that Almaty became something of a transnational center for the Uyghur nation in the 1990s. Because not only were there Uyghurs coming from China, but because there was relative freedom of expression, I remember when I was doing my field work, you would see all kinds of leaders from the Uyghur diaspora in various countries coming to visit Kazakhstan. Erkin Alpatyekin coming from Europe, leaders coming from Australia, and there was an opportunity to somewhat negotiate a transnational Uyghur nation in the city. And I was going to put a picture here, but I forgot. And the other aspect was the post-Soviet cultural reawakening, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, where religion had been strictly regulated, and to a large degree cultural expressions were at least regulated in a certain kind of framework. In the 1990s, there was a real opportunity for people to explore their cultural heritage, their ethnic uniqueness, and religion. And among the Uyghurs at that time, there was a particular interest in this, because they also were having access to Uyghurs in China. So there was an opportunity to revive all kinds of cultural practices that provided a lot of the social space for Uyghur self-governmentality. And I've kind of broken down the social space in terms of the actual place, the structure that allowed for social interaction, and the actual social interaction. So first of all, the place. This is an interesting story how Uyghur neighborhoods came to be in the city of Almaty, because the Soviet Union did not encourage urban ethnic enclaves. And Almaty was very much a Soviet city, so there weren't really ethnic neighborhoods in Almaty. However, the Soviet Union did encourage collective farms to be based in terms of ethnicity. They felt, for whatever reasons, it made sense for ethnic groups to live in the same villages and work together. And the Uyghur population, particularly a lot of those who came from China in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of whom were urban people, decided they wanted to live in collective farms that surrounded the city of Almaty. And as a result, you had all of these Uyghur neighborhoods, or all these Uyghur collective farms encircling the city. And as the city grew and there was a need to create new apartment blocks and so on, a lot of these collective farms became actual urban neighborhoods. The first one being Sultan Kurgan, which happened in the 1960s, and it's named after the Ili Sultan, actually, who, after the Russians gave the Ili region back to the Qing dynasty in the 1880s, they gave him land on the outskirts of Almaty that became a collective farm, and then eventually the neighborhood of Sultan Kurgan. And then there were 3 more collective farms in the 80s and 90s that became part of the city. And going back to the map, you kind of see where they are, and they basically encircle the city. So this kind of created, at this time, islands of Uyghurstan around the city of Almaty. But of course, place is not enough. Any urban enclave doesn't give you self-governmentality itself. There has to be some sort of structure of governance. And at this time I found that there was a very kind of quick development of neighborhood governance, informal neighborhood governance in each of these neighborhoods. And there were 2 driving forces in this. One was the mosque. Most of these neighborhoods created their own Uyghur mosque, where sermons were given in Uyghur, and also the institution of the Jigabéshi, which was a leader in the neighborhood. So at the mosque was more than just a religious conduit. It was also became very much a community center, particularly for elders. And you had kind of a council of elders, very informal, in every neighborhood, who would often be consulted in big neighborhood decisions. But there was also a decision to elect a Jigabéshi, who was a middle-aged man who would essentially do the work of governance, who would, and the major parts of local governance involved scheduling life cycle rituals, so everybody in the neighborhood could go to every wedding and every circumcision and every funeral and so on. And also regulating those in terms of how much money should be spent on them, so that people weren't competing to kind of outshow each other. But it also had to do with dealing with local issues. If there were being a drug problem in the neighborhood, a road needed to be fixed, the Jigabéshi was always the person to go to. And when I wanted to find a place to live and do my field work, I went to a Jigabéshi of the neighborhood, and he immediately, within 10 hours, got me a place to stay. So these institutions provide the discipline of the permissible and non-permissible in society, and help to provide a context through which the nation could be negotiated through community practices. Which brings me to the social interaction. Given the existence of Uyghur places in the Uyghur neighborhoods of Almaty, and the structure of regulation created by this informal governance, you had an opportunity for people to interact in a very kind of controlled manner. And you had Uyghurs, not only local Uyghurs, but Uyghurs from China also interacting, and sometimes Uyghurs from elsewhere. And it was also an opportunity to negotiate ideas about what the Uyghur nation really meant. For example, things like how does Islam, what role does Islam play in being Uyghur? Can Uyghurs drink vodka? Things like that. But also the aspirations of the nation. What should there be? Should there be a Uyghur state someday, or is it more important that Uyghur rights are protected? And I found that there were life cycle rituals were a very significant part of this. At life cycle rituals, you had opportunities for toasts. You had issues about who was seated where. You had decisions about whether the imam was playing a prominent role in it or not, and so on, and whether vodka was served. Religious holidays, likewise, the imam of the neighborhood was often very much involved in deciding how a neighborhood would celebrate a religious holiday, but also on a local level, you had a lot of interaction during this time to discuss what was proper and improper observance of the holiday. And then finally, the mashrab, which I'm not going to go into too much detail on because the next paper is on that topic. But as a gathering of men of a similar age group, providing opportunity for relaxation, discussion of political issues, and a lot of self-regulation of issues of morality. Depending on the mashrab, a lot of them would involve discussions about proper and improper behavior. So, what's the legacy of this period in the 1990s? It was, I think, a real opportunity where you began to see Uyghurs on both sides of the border and from elsewhere in diaspora coming to Almaty and being able to renegotiate what it meant to be a Uyghur at a very important time historically. The fall of the Soviet Union, the gradual beginning of a new crackdown, as the last paper talked about, in China, and also it provided an opportunity to reinvigorate the resilience of the community. And as a result, you saw, I witnessed at this time, the Uyghur community being able to mobilize quickly. For example, the riots that took place in Kulja in 1998, after that happened, we saw the neighborhoods in Almaty quickly organized to provide interviews, find witnesses, to talk to international media, which had all been redirected to Almaty because they couldn't go to China. Unfortunately, a lot of this structure is now gone. And as was discussed before lunch, beginning in the 2000s and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's interaction in Central Asia, we see the Central Asian states start to surveil Uyghur communities much more and prevent a lot of interaction between Uyghurs from China and from Central Asia. However, some of these structures are still there. In fact, the Jigit Beshi, the last time I was in Almaty, Jigit Beshis are not only in these neighborhoods that they were in the 90s, they're virtually in every area where Uyghurs live. So there is a sense of self-governmentality still. And I think that also gives the community a lot of resilience. So just in concluding, I do view this moment as a somewhat unique moment in Uyghur history, but not necessarily an anomaly in the history of the Uyghurs. I think that if we were able to go back and look at various times where there's been Uyghur communities living in weak states, there's been an opportunity for self-organization. And obviously I can't put myself back in history and prove that fact, but I'm assuming that this is something that you may see again as well. And it's also, I also want to just raise the question in conclusion about whether it's something that's happening now in many places where Uyghurs live around the world. And there's a lot more transnational interaction in it because with the internet and with transportation now you can essentially bring together a group of very diverse Uyghurs in various communities around the world. Over the last couple of years, I've done some research in the neighborhood, the Istanbul neighborhood of Zeytinburnu, and I see some of the same kind of feeling of self-governmentality there. Arguably, you could say the same thing for the Uyghur community here in Fairfax, Virginia. They've certainly mobilized to help people pick people up at the airport. So what I see is that we're developing social spaces in islands of Uyghurstan around the world. Thank you.